So, good morning, everyone. Great to see you all here. My name's Jonathan Curtis, and welcome to today's briefing on the ACT Government's discussion paper on the consultation draft. That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? Of the Nature Conservation Strategy. Coming to you today from Ngunnawal country, I'm in the Conservation Council office, as many of you will recognise. The ACT government released the paper in January for community consultation. After reading it, it's quite a contrast with the climate change strategy that we discussed last week. It's, to my untrained eye, it seems like a fairly solid piece of work, but our expert guest this morning will run us through it. We hear from both the Conservation Council's Executive Director, Dr. Simon Copeland, who probably needs no introduction. And we're also joined by Matt Whiting, I'm sorry, who is the chair of the Conservation Council's Biodiversity Working Group. Matt's a scientist and has spent decades working to establish and then manage protected areas. He then studied environmental law before finishing his working life assessing applications for development, which must have been a challenging task at times. They'll give you a briefing on the paper and talk about also how the Conservation Council is going to be responding to it. Matt and Simon, a very warm welcome and good morning. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen now so we can just share slides with you. So that should be sharing now. And I will just go to the slideshow. So can everybody see that slideshow now? So welcome everybody and thank you. I'm actually going to speak for just for a short period today and then hand over to Matt, who is really the expert on all of these issues and has delved into this nature conservation strategy a lot more in a lot of depth and so really knows a lot about this issue. We will talk for around about half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we'll take questions at the end. So I just wanted to, basically what I'll do is just do a brief introduction to the nature conservation strategy and then hand over to Matt, who will talk about the details of the document. I'd also just like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Ngunnawal land and also acknowledge other Aboriginal groups in this region, the Ngambri and Ngero people. I always think in all of this work that we're doing that First Nations justice is really core to this, to the work that we do at the Conservation Council, and it's particularly true when looking at something like this document, which is about managing land. And the ACT is the only place, the only state or territory that doesn't have any native title claims or legally acknowledged native title claims. And the only place where we don't have real active management, legally binding active management of lands for Aboriginal people, run by Aboriginal people. And so there's a lot of discussion in this nature conservation strategy about engagement with Ngunnawal peoples. And we think it's really integral that work is done really strongly and meaningfully, and that engagement is really central to this strategy going forward in the next 10 years. So it's really important to acknowledge that up front. So as I said, I'm just going to be doing a brief introduction to the strategy. I want to talk a little bit about what the strategy is, how it sits in the broader scheme of conservation and nature conservation in the ACT, and some of the broad views that we have. And then I'm going to hand over to Matt, who will talk about this in a lot more detail. So for people's awareness, the Nature Conservation Strategy is the key document that guides how we conserve nature in the ACT. It guides how we think about what conserving nature looks like and develops the plans or the overarching view to develop plans for how we do so. And this is about, historically, a lot of the work around within the Nature Conservation Strategy has been focused on reserve management, and it has also focused on how we manage threatened species. And one of the big shifts in this nature conservation strategy that Matt will talk about a lot is a shift away from focusing on particular reserves to be looking at more of a landscape scale approach to nature conservation that takes into account reserves and non-reserve areas and the importance of non-reserve areas. For that reason, we welcome the development of this strategy. We think that it's an important step up for protection of nature in the ACT, and want to say that the government has taken a genuinely consultative approach to its development. And we can compare this, I can contrast it, I think Jonathan has, to the government's climate discussion paper, where there was some consultation on that document, but it was quite minimal. It was done very, what we considered in a rushed manner at the end of last year. Whereas the nature conservation strategy has been in development for a number of years now, probably since about 2023. And in particular, there was quite a lot of consultation, not just with the Conservation Council, but with other organisations. Last year, a number of workshops, we received multiple first drafts of this document, which we provided feedback on. We've had multiple meetings with the team developing this document. We also believe that this team who's developed this document have been doing a lot of internal consultation with other parts of the ACT government. And that's because there are real significant shifts in how we think about nature in this strategy. And in doing so, they've done the work, they've had to do quite a lot of work of bringing other parts of government on board, which is a really positive thing that they've been doing. So what's the core overarching approach to this strategy? The strategy promises what's called a nature positive future for the territory with a focus on landscape scale planning. Just want to talk about those two key points. So nature positive is a term that has been used globally for some time and was used by the Australian federal government up until about last year when they started dropping the term because it became attached to legislation that they dropped before the election, not last year, 2024, before the 2025 election. But we're really glad to see that the ACT government is still using this term. And what it means is that we're thinking not just about how we conserve areas that are still very important, but also how we can regenerate and have a positive future. How can we rebuild nature, and how can we invest in nature over the next 10 years, in this case, to have a stronger outcome. So it's not just about stopping decline, but instead turning things around, turning the corner, so that we can see a more positive outcome for nature within this time frame, which is the next 10 years. So we're really glad that the government has committed to that here in the ACT. That is, of course, extremely aspirational, and it is a big idea and requires resourcing. And so this is a step up for the ACT government, and one of the things will be ensuring that they follow through in achieving this. The second key focus of the strategy is a focus on landscape scale planning. And what this means is that we're going to move beyond isolated development assessments to instead account for the cumulative impacts on biodiversity and a landscape scale. And this is a recognition that at the moment, in our planning system in particular, we look at things at a block by block level, and there is analysis done in development applications that looks at it, what's the impact on this particular block when the development application is put in. And what that means, and we're seeing this across the territory, is that we're seeing a death by 1,000 cuts in which parts of nature are being destroyed because the impact on an individual block may be considered to be minor, but when you accumulate that across the territory, it results in significant loss for nature. One of the areas where we're seeing this very clearly is in the loss of mature trees, which are essential for biodiversity for fauna in the ACT. But when applications are put in, they say, well, look, we're only losing 1 or 2 mature trees, so it's okay. But when we see that across the territory, we're losing hundreds, if not thousands, of these trees. And so shifting to this landscape scale planning means mapping the entirety of the landscape, identifying key areas of value and protecting those up front, so that then planning can operate a bit more smoothly and not have this death by 1,000 cuts approach. So those are the kind of two key overarching themes of the strategy, which we think are really positive. But there are some devils in the detail and some more detail that needs to be looked into. The final point I want to make is that we will be advocating now for this strategy to be backed by a significant uplift in funding and resourcing to ensure that it can actually be implemented. As I noted before, the strategy is aspirational. It has a lot of really good goals in it, but they will not be achievable with the current funding that we have for nature in the ACT. We have an opportunity now in that the government has put this document out. The government has committed to this approach, at least has committed to these overarching approaches, even if some of the detail may change following consultation. And that means that we have an opportunity to say to them, well, if this is your policy approach to nature conservation, you need to be increasing funding and resourcing to make it happen. And you need to be thinking more cleverly about the resourcing we currently have to ensure that this can be implemented over the next 10 years. Here at the Conservation Council, we're also developing and running a campaign that's about federal funding for nature, and federal funding for nature is going to be really integral to the implementation of the nature conservation strategy. Federal funding for nature is woefully low. It's currently less than 0.1% of the federal budget goes into nature and biodiversity. The campaign we'll be having will be to boost that to 1% of the federal budget, which is a tenfold increase, but still a tiny proportion of our budget for these issues. And that will have flow-on effects. If implemented, it'll have flow-on effects for the ACT to be able to implement things like this. So we'll be campaigning both at a local and a federal for increased funding to allow better protection of our nature. So those are my overarching views. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Matt, and Matt will be able to talk you through a lot more of the detail of the nature conservation strategy and how we at the Conservation Council are responding to it. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I too would like to acknowledge that we're on First Nations people's land. Respect to any of our First Nations people joining us. Thank you for doing so. We would certainly welcome any further contributions to the Council's development of its submissions. So I've kind of got this central role in putting together a response on behalf of the Council, but we welcome contributions from others. So First Nations people, anyone, please get in touch with us if you've got views. My awareness of issues is limited to those things that I've got some experience and knowledge on, and it certainly doesn't cover the field. So, we do encourage other people to get involved here. We really need to stand up, I think, to put forward our thoughts at this vital stage. So in terms of the structure of this strategy, draft strategy, it's supported by 3 supplements that help explain its logic. And I've spent a good deal of time looking at those. The first of them is the Climate Adaptation for Nature Conservation supplement. After an explanation of the problem, and I'm not going to go into the detail about that, the supplement outlines how officials plan to respond to the effects of climate change on nature. The plan, as I read it, is to adopt what's known as the Resist, Accept, Direct framework. This framework is already in use in Australia and overseas. It appears to me to be based on planning scenarios, choosing the one that best fits, watching and monitoring what happens, and adapting management, with a great emphasis on systematic learning. Now, that's a highly specialist field, and I'm not an expert in that, but I can offer this. The approach got a big rap recently from Dr. Liz Ashby at the Biodiversity Council during a webinar titled Preparing for a More Volatile Future. So, Simon, I'll ask if you would please share in the chat a link to that webinar. And if you go to minute 37, you can hear what Liz has to say about it. Please don't do it now, but copy that link and have a look later. Starting at minute 37, goes for 12 minutes. I'm not going to spend a lot more time on that, nor am I going to dive into the intricate detail of any of the supplements. The second on landscape scale conservation, including by the identification and protection of priority conservation areas, or PCAs, is the subject of much of this discussion. So I'll keep moving on just at the moment. I also won't say a lot about restoration practice. I hope it's enough that I mention, I think really good thinking has been applied, and there is a high degree of consistency in what I've read with the national standards for the practice of ecological restoration in Australia. The things to be delivered during the life of the strategy are shown in roughly the order we might expect to see them. I believe the staff involved will make sure implementation is well planned and indicators will work so that progress can be measured effectively. These folks working in the City Environment Directorate working on this strategy have got flowcharts full of milestones to be met en route to demonstrating that each target has been achieved. It's still unfolding and being unpacked because, well, for example, the plan might well change as a result of this public comment period, and plotting all the steps involved in demonstrating achievement takes a lot of time and work. So there's been a certain amount of work done to ensure that implementation is possible and indicators can be identified that will enable progress to be demonstrated, but we don't have the implementation roadmap nor the indicator framework at this stage. What I therefore want to do is to point to an example of their work. Look at the report on implementation of the last strategy. Another link to be shared there to what is a pretty high, I think, a very high quality report on the implementation of the last strategy. And there are some frightening data there about the state of the environment and the loss in particular of some of the critically endangered lowland vegetation and ecological communities in the north of the ACT. Amendments to the Nature Conservation Act will come in two tranches. Easy ones are going to come first, and that could be as early as this year. More amendments will follow later to support the making of a landscape plan and all of the other policies that are shown on the screen and that I'll be discussing in the minutes ahead. We don't at this stage have any detail about precisely how those amendments will be made, whether there'll be exposure drafts for us to comment on. A lot of things in the strategy really depend, they'll go hand in hand with amendments to the Act. So we're in need during the life of the strategy to see not only the policies, but the accompanying amendments to the Act. Next slide, please, Simon. So a landscape scale conservation approach is where I'm going to focus a good deal of time. As Simon said, it's a global push for outcomes to be achieved. The strategy says reform is needed to the entire nature conservation framework to 1, balance development, conservation and climate change. 2, introduce a range of collaborative approaches to planning and decision making. And 3, achieve financial sustainability for long-term impact. Now, my mind goes to some of the national environmental law reforms, which, among other things, sought to minimise regulatory duplication. The Australian government, in the background, has now got new known pathways for assessments and approvals, new pathways that will come into effect on the 1st of December this year. Subject to the states and territories agreeing to meet new standards that are also in the process of being made, these new pathways will start to be used. And the ACT government will be making, we expect, decisions that will meet not only ACT but national law for approval purposes. The strategy that we're seeing unfold here must be viewed as the ACT government preparing for that one-stop streamlined future in a regulatory sense. Over the next decade, it's expected the ACT will see a 17% increase in population. The scale of houses and jobs needed is another reason a whole of landscape approach is needed. It's more efficient. As Simon suggested, or indicated. Each proposal won't be for individual blocks, but potentially multiple suburbs at a time, including the necessary transport corridors, including the provision of services like water, power, sewage and communication. At the same time, nature will get better consideration because the cumulative impacts will be considered at an early, more appropriate subdivision-like stage during assessment and approval processes. At that stage, conditions can be attached to approvals requiring, for nature's benefit, better and more appropriate avoidance, protection, repair and reconnection of nature. The Council and Friends of Grasslands have been calling for a biodiversity network to be permanently protected outside the ACT's protected areas for years. So we're delighted a nature conservation network's finally on the drawing board. For nature's sake, in the urban and peri-urban parts of the northern ACT, we're looking for the nature conservation network to include high conservation value areas outside reserves, less degraded sites that can effectively and efficiently be restored, buffers around these sites, connections between them, and we want the management of all these areas to be coordinated and effective. We're not so pleased the NCN is still years away to be defined later in the landscape plan. We really are impatient looking for progress towards getting the nature conservation network up and running. What is to be achieved straight away in 2026 is the identification of priority conservation areas, or PCAs. Now, the strategy calls PCAs the backbone of the nature conservation network. Avoiding these places can and will take a lot of heat out of development conflicts. For the protection of nature outside the ACT's protected areas, it is very clearly a tremendous opportunity and welcomed. Let's get the important places we love protected. On identifying priority conservation areas within the ACT's protected areas, here we're not so sure. If it results in programs being channeled and funding, investment funding being focused on smaller areas within reserves, that could be a problem, because we would say, I'm sure others would join us in saying, the ACT government is obliged under the Nature Conservation Act and its regulations to support and resource the Parks and Conservation Service so it can conserve all of the ACT's reserves. Simon's already made the point, resourcing is a diabolical problem here. I'll come back to it a little bit shortly. The strategy says one important benefit of priority conservation areas is that development will avoid, by development avoiding priority conservation areas, we reinforce the mitigation hierarchy. Just want to point out the council's got some issue with that. It's great priority PCAs will be avoided by developers. However, it's not possible to assume if we just avoid priority conservation areas, given the scale of what's expected to be lost, that will be enough avoidance. Given the complexity and the degree of difficulty involved in doing nature repair, every hectare of impact on intact and relatively intact nature over the next decade is going to set us back, regardless of where it occurs. It increases the pressure on nature and makes a nature positive outcome that much harder to deliver. So the council will be asking for some rewording, re-emphasis in relation to what the strategy says about the mitigation hierarchy. It needs to protect the whole of the nature conservation network. It doesn't even stop there. The mitigation hierarchy applies when a developer chooses a site. If there is a mature tree with nesting hollows on a development site and it can be protected, do it, because that will help to minimise the impacts on nature. Even after developments are constructed, mitigation continues by controlling cats, hardening paths, imposing a speed limit that will minimise collisions. I want to turn to the identification of PCAs. I know the criteria have been shared with a small group of people. The process is plotted, it's explained in detail in the second supplement. Once the values of areas are known and mapped, this work must be almost complete. A strategic decision-making process will be undertaken within government between the Environment and Planning arms of the City and Environment Directorate. The strategy says, and I quote, "Currently planned development needs will be overlaid on a map of critical values. Decisions will be made around the ecological, cultural and social value of each area, resulting in the mapping of PCAs that are effective and acceptable for both ecological and urban planning purposes," unquote. Now, call me a nerd, but I'd like to be in that room to hear those discussions, and I will be suggesting that the council call for that process to be open. It might not be that everyone wants to go, but some people will. And the process, the negotiations over those priority conservation areas, when it's a balance of development and conservation based on the values, based on the development intentions, that's important. I come back again to mention that the emphasis in the strategy on measuring outcomes is really, really good. That's a fine thing. I think it's important to point out that there is some concern about the protection of the nature conservation network and priority conservation areas. As I mentioned, the call for a biodiversity network has always been based on there being permanent protection for what's important outside our reserve system. From the definition of the nature conservation network, we know it will consist of protected and conserved areas. Righto, protected areas, I think most of us know what that means. The protected bit is thinking about its legal status. They're valuable areas for nature and or culture. They're dedicated to the conservation of those values. And that dedication is permanent and secure. Now, by contrast, conserved areas are a relatively new construct. To be sure, they're found all around Earth. Elsewhere, in other countries, they're known as other effective area-based conservation measures. So I hear you ask, what's the difference? Well, like protected areas, conserved areas are recognised as having important values for nature. It's where the land manager is managing and has committed to continue managing for the conservation of those values. If all those preconditions are satisfied, they apply, then voila, a conserved area can be recognised. The difference, what is different to protected areas, is that of itself, in and of itself, conserved area recognition provides no legal protection. That is because Australia's framework is very clear. A commitment to manage a conserved area for conservation can be withdrawn at any time. Now, other measures can firm up commitments made by land managers. Might be a nature repair agreement for 25 or 100 years. Brilliant. If that supports the retention and the continued management for conservation, great. But it's a worry that conserved areas in and of themselves provides no protection. So we will be calling, I hope, the council will be calling for a better, stronger commitment to protect the parts of the nature conservation network, including priority conservation areas. The very last point is to mention on this slide that the conserved area policy is to be made by 2029. It's the detail about what it means for the nature conservation network to be cross-tenure. It will set out all of the land uses that are appropriate by tenure type and the sort of management that is are dependent on the values present and that tenure. So just to be sure, the Nature Conservation Network, it's expected that it will be declared on urban open space, rural leases, urban leases, horse paddocks potentially, travelling stock routes. It's a fascinating time. All right, next slide, please, Simon. The strategy is clear, and Simon's really alluded to this earlier, that offsets are central to the achievement of nature positive outcomes. If there's a loss, then an approval will require a gain. Now, again, there's a lot happening federally. In relation to offsets, the legal environment has changed and is continuing to change. First, from the 1st of December this year at the national level for new referrals, offsets practice will be governed by the amended EPBC Act. Now that's a mouthful. What does it mean? It means that the existing EPBC Act environmental offsets policy is going to gradually be phased out. The strategy confirms that at the moment, the 2015 ACT environment offsets policy, is not in force. And as the federal policy is phased out, the lack of an ACT policy could start to become an issue. The national environmental law reforms provide for the making of national environmental standards and agreements. Now, we don't have any of those things yet, but it's clear the ACT strategy is anticipating those things being made, standards and agreements. That means that at some time within the next decade, the Territory will, we expect, be making an agreement with the Commonwealth in which the ACT government will confirm that its approval decisions, including its offset decisions, will satisfy national standards. So we know an offset standard is being made. At the moment, the problem, as I say, is the absence of a local strategy, the phasing out of the federal strategy. Until a restoration contributions policy is made that contains detail, there will be, to my reading of it, no principles governing the practice of offsetting in the ACT. Okay, I'll come back to the principles that are missing in a minute. Really, really quickly. How do offsets work and how is that changing? We know to date that averted loss has been the main form of offsets. Yes, you can damage this place, providing you find another place that's like the place being lost and protect that. So the approval might say, find that other site. It must be like for like and under threat. If needed, acquire it, legally protect it, and manage it for the benefit of the matter that's being lost at the impact site. That form of offsetting has been criticised as resulting in the protection of places that aren't under threat. And we've seen it here in the ACT. To offset development between Coombs and Whitlam, development that was approved in 2011 and will continue for years, west and north around the Arboretum, around the back of the Arboretum. To offset all that development, Coombs to Whitlam, what suburbs, new suburbs called Salmon, Bandler that haven't even been begun yet. The banks of the Molongla River were protected and are now managed for conservation as an offset. Were the banks of the Molongla River ever going to be developed? If your answer is no, then the benefit of protecting that as an offset for nature is questionable. It was never going to be lost. So, what's replacing averted loss offsetting? It's, as Simon's mentioned, heading offsets in the direction of restoring that which is degraded. It's got to be a good thing. There's a recognition that restoration work is best organised centrally, strategically, rather than requiring approval holders to manage offsets. where their focus may be elsewhere and they may allocate fewer resources to it, approval holders will be able to pay to acquit their offset obligations. Now, we haven't got detail about how that's going to work here. So again, quickly looking at the federal reform. From the 1st of December, for new referrals, a restoration contributions holder will be responsible to, after money is deposited, restoration contributions are paid, deliver restoration actions, monitor and evaluate progress, maintain a public register and prepare reports on nature positive outcomes. So if the same sort of approach is adopted in the restoration contributions policy here locally, then spending will be directed, to adopt again the words from the EPBC Act, toward protecting, conserving and restoring the affected matter in the bioregion where the affected matter is located, unquote. So, in the very near future, approval holders will have the option of delivering their own offsets via their own actions or paying restoration contributions. The strategy paves the way for the adoption of this approach, and it means right now the absence of principles like thou shalt protect an offset site or restore an offset site that is like or has the potential to be like that which is lost is important. The timing of offsets is important. They need to be delivered at or around the time that the loss is occurring. There's multiple principles which I expect the Council will document in its submission and that we would like to see going into the strategy to cover the short period that will exist between now and the making of good policy at national and local levels. Last slide, please, Simon, for me. Last slide for me. So, resourcing. It really does come down to this. The strategy indicates business as usual funding will continue. We know, in concert with the existing conservation framework, that business as usual funding has not been enough. I've just set out some real concerns about resourcing the achievement of nature positive outcomes. If it's dependent on offset payments, there's still quite a few unknowns. We know that all of the work to put in place restoration contribution payments, make that possible, feeds a new investment model. And once that's in place, reading the detail of a couple of targets identified there on the screen, you can sort of follow the bouncing ball and see what will support the delivery of a whole bunch of nature positive outcomes. Sorry, that wasn't the last slide. The last slide, overall. Look, I'm just going to pause and let you, if I invite you, to have a quick read of that. Now, it needs no further comment because I think I've covered the points. Have a moment, have a read, and then I would like to turn it back to you, Simon and Jonathan, to open it up to questions. Thank you.
I'll just give people 1 minute to have a read of this slide, which is a really good overall summary of how we're responding to this document. And then I've got one more slide and then we'll go to questions. Okay, alrighty. We'll share these slides to folks as well after this when we have the video ready. So it'll probably be next week. So people can look at these. We'll share the slides with the email to everybody who's registered. So I'll just move on for the moment. So just a little bit of admin around this. So, as Matt has indicated, the Conservation Council will be making a submission on this document. If you're a member of a member group and or come to our biodiversity working group, that our submission will be shared for feedback. But we also encourage everybody else to make a submission before the 27th of March via the ACT Government's Your Say platform, or you can email your written comments to natureconservationpolicy@act.gov.au. Emily in our office, who unfortunately just couldn't be here today for this, is developing alongside with Matt a submission guide, which will bring down some of the detail to some more overall points, which we'll provide to everybody. That will be sent to our email list, which will provide you with tips for writing your submission and some key points to include. It's not quite ready yet, but we will be providing it soon. So keep your eye out for your emails, because that submission guide, if you're looking to make a submission, will provide you some easy approaches and some key points based very similar to what we've already said today. We really encourage everyone to make a submission. One of the risks to this document is that there are some really positive things here. We want to ensure that those positive things don't get watered down. So please boost the positive things as well as make comments on areas where we think we can have improvement. And that's a particular make comments around resourcing. So please do both of those things, because we don't want the government or parts of the government to water down some of these core components. But we also want to ensure that we strengthen it where possible. So that's the end of our slideshow. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing. I haven't noticed any questions come through in the chat, so I'm going to hand over to you, Jonathan, and you can chair for organising some question and answer.
Fantastic. Thanks, Simon and Matt. That was a really good and comprehensive overview of it. As I suspected at the beginning, there's a lot of really good stuff in there. I was really quite impressed on reading it. So what if I'll open it to the floor, as it were. If you have any questions, put them into the chat. And I see John's put one in. Don't offsets always equal loss of habitat? Aren't restoration contributions highly unlikely to result in a nature positive outcome? Who's best placed for that? That sounds like a Matt question.
Thank you, John. Yes, and Jonathan, I'm happy to take that one. Look, by definition, if you've got an offset, then you've got a loss. So yes, offsets and loss go hand in hand. The nature positive approach is suggesting that the amount of loss will be exceeded by the amount of gain. Now, you're right to question whether or not restoration contributions can achieve that very high standard. It's essential that they do, but that's what sort of underscores the point that we can't afford to lose valuable places, that the mitigation hierarchy is needed to limit damage even where development is occurring, so that nature positive outcomes are a genuine possibility.
I'll just make a comment on this as well. I think we've been highly critical of offset policy in the ACT for quite some time, not just in the ACT, but federally as well. There are some potential improvements here as part of this strategy, but it's something that we'll really be keeping our eye on, because when you rely on offsets, it becomes really easy for things to for good intentions to become lost very quickly. And that's one of the reasons why we're emphasising this as part of our response.
Just go to a question from Jackie, because it follows on the offsets issue. Jackie asks, some of the points mentioned rely on the ACT offsets policy and framework to be updated or replaced with a new policy and framework. If the current documents are not in force, and we see the impacts of this now, what's your confidence level that this issue will be addressed, and what happens if it isn't?
It is a problem that the ACT government is understandably trying to give itself the flexibility to accept and take as the standard to be applied here the offset standard that is still to be made at the federal level. So the problem, which I'm probably not explaining very well, is hopefully a relatively short-term problem where all the principles that are embedded in the existing EPBC Act Environmental Offsets Policy and the ACT Environmental Offsets Policy, in the absence of those principles, what happens? What governs offsets? At the end of the day, you've got those policies in place and they are only policies. So we can point to lots of examples of where the policies haven't been strictly applied. Implementation has been an issue. So, this is a critical and really important point that we do want to see some principles brought in, even if it's just for an interim period, so that there are the sorts of standards we would expect to see in place, and we can point to them and say, well, look, a specific decision isn't following that. It's incredibly important when you think that in the next couple of years, we might have development approved all the way from east of Mount Majura to Hume in the Eastern Broadacre Strategic Assessment Area. So what's my confidence level? I'm not going to put a number on it. Suffice to say, I'm really quite concerned about the absence of principles right now.
Thanks, Matt. Let's go to some questions that Pamela has put in. What are the criteria for the PCAs? And does this approach mean that planning have to consider environment criteria? And then third part of that, once PCAs are identified, what will the protection be?
Okay, I'll start with the criteria. The criteria, I understand, are still in development. So remembering that the strategy says PCAs will exist by the end of 2026, the fact that we haven't in the public eye got the criteria by which PCAs will be identified yet, yes, it's an issue. I know, I haven't seen them myself, but I know they have been shared with a small group of folk who are ecologists, and so they are working through it. And for reference, you could look at the National Roadmap for the Achievement of 30 by 30. I'll put the link in the chat in a minute. There is a table on page 40. The criteria there talk about the addition of places that are priorities for nature. Getting them into the protected area system is what's desired. Now, okay, is that what's happening here? Well, if priority conservation areas, to go to the second part of your question, are protected as PCAs with conserved area recognition, in and of itself, it, as I was saying, doesn't give protection. It's an expectation, it's an intention to manage for the long term, and that is fantastic. Don't get me wrong. A hand-on-heart commitment that a place will be managed for conservation for the long term is great. What worries me is intentions can change. From a legal point of view, conserved area recognition gives no protection. I hope that answers your question, Pamela.
Yes, Pam's looking like it. You confirmed her worst fears. Let's go to Ian's question. Is there a link between the district plan's green and blue corridors? The NCCC would like to see this spatial mapping and district plans treated as shared across strategies, live and accessible documents.
I think so the strategy talks about PCAs feeding up into the next iteration of the district strategies. So I understand they exist for 5 years. They were made in 2023. The next district strategies are due to be published therefore in 2028. I think we will see the priority conservation areas used to deconflict development a lot sooner than that. The planners, I'm putting words into I'm channeling the planners here, and it's a really dangerous thing to do. I can't speak for them. But what I observe is that, it's wonderful. We're identifying where the important places are, the PCAs, where they should be. But it's a two-edged sword. Once you've done that, does it mean that development frees up and is easier elsewhere? Well, the district strategies are something that we can then fall back on in an interim period. Again, I hope that sort of gives you some sense of how I understand it to work, Ian. Thank you for your question.
Can I make a comment on this one as well, Jonathan? Two comments. One around the blue-green network. One of the things that we've noticed around the blue-green network and the district strategies is that they're not particularly enforceable, and we are seeing development applications occurring in these spaces, and it then goes to planning, and we see this kind of what we're calling the death by a thousand cuts, where it goes, well, in this instance, it's okay if we cut into the blue-green network. If this instance, it's okay, blah, and that just happens over and over again. So this is why seeing a landscape plan that is enforceable legally, protection is legally enforceable is done is very, very important. The other comment I'd like to make is that the ACT government is doing a lot of planning, and there's a lot of these kinds of plans. So there's these district strategies, they're developing these PCAs, which, as Matt has said, will be identified by the end of the year. And we also have the upcoming landscape plan, which is in the strategy said to be the document that will identify the nature conservation network. How these all talk together and what the differences are between them, and which ones are legally enforceable, which ones the planners have to follow, which ones they don't, is still a bit murky. And particularly when you add the landscape plan in, it becomes even murkier about what that document is going to do, and whether we're spending money on a landscape plan is a great idea, but are we spending money on a document that will sit in a drawer that won't be enforceable? So I think we're going to have to, the government needs to do a bit more explaining about how these documents and these strategies all talk to each other, and which ones we actually have to follow and which ones can be put away somewhere and ignored, because that's a real concern for us, and that's why we continue to call that the nature conservation network needs to be in legislation. It needs to be enforceable, and we need to have proper protection of areas within the NC and the nature conservation network.
We certainly seem to live in a jurisdiction blessed with more plans than you could poke a stick at. It's quite an issue about trying to get a sense of how they all interconnect, and I keep discovering new ones. Pam, you make a comment about how we're going to change or influence the pro-development culture of planning, and particularly the bit from me, how we make sure that we're keeping the conservation aspects front of mind with a government that is very, very focused on housing. That might be a Simon question.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, Pam, and we've seen a range of concerns, a range of stories coming out, talking about showing the real pro-development culture of planning and of the government itself. And we see this in the way that they're emphasising a range of policies at the moment, that the target for housing is extremely important, but the target for housing is the be-all and end-all of government policy at the moment. And there's a range of concerns that we have around them watering down processes for development in order to achieve that target. And then using the argument that if you want to be pro-environment, that you're stopping people from having houses. And that's a really false dynamic. we think that it's interesting in this context about how this strategy has been able to move forward, because there are elements here where there are some concerns I think that Matt has raised, that this could be used as a way to then facilitate that by allowing for easier processes for development. While on the flip side, the other double-edged sword is that we can see greater protection of areas that we do love and of areas. One concern I have is that we don't want to see mapping. So one of the things that the government is doing now is mapping the territory to look at the areas that are of value, and we don't want to see a map that is sort of done in one point of time that says in 2026 this is the map we did, and this says this is the areas of value, and this is the areas that aren't of value, and that is how we make all planning decisions in the future. And areas that aren't of value are suddenly open slather, because that would raise a whole bunch of concerns. Because particularly in a changing climate, our areas of value for biodiversity are going to change over time. And that's going to be something we're going to have to consider. So yeah, there's a lot of concerns there. How do we change that? I think we just have to keep campaigning and fighting. And I know, Pam, you're probably asking these questions from the perspective of Callum and the terrible decision that was made there, and continues to be made there. And I think that you're an example of someone who continues to fight, and we're going to continue to fight against those kind of decisions here across the territory.
Just to add, Simon, if I may, the initial identification of PCAs is in the strategy by no means final. The strategy provides for more PCAs to be identified through time as data and research unfolds and as we observe the effects of climate change. That's a positive.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. Judith, I see that Matt answered your question directly in the chat. Does that answer the question? We're nearly out of time. I think we might wrap it up at that point. There's some more fantastic questions in there, but on this subject, we could really go for another hour or so. Thank you so much for all the great questions. I didn't even have to think of a single one.
Can I just? What I'll do is I'll pop my email address in the chat. If you have a question that you'd like to have answered, please just send me an email. I'll likely pass it on to Matt. But that way, if one of your questions wasn't answered, I might not have caught it. Please just send it to me via email, and I'll pass it on to Matt, and we'll get an answer for you.
Thanks, Simon. And I think obviously the task of keeping the government focused on these things and also giving them the social license to keep pushing hard on it will really come down to the work of all the organisations that comprise the Conservation Council, and we'll keep doing our bit. On that note, let's wrap up for the day. Simon and Matt, thanks for the briefing, and Matt for all your hard work. Apologies to everyone if you had any difficulty hearing Matt. We were aware of that problem before we started when we did our tech checks, but there wasn't much we could do about it. So I hope you all did actually manage to hear it. I was okay, but I hope there weren't any problems. I hope to see you all for our next webinars. Don't forget, if you missed one or want to watch it again, you can find them on the Con Council website, and there's even a YouTube channel for the Conservation Council that I recommend you keep an eye on as well. We'll finish it there. Have a great day and see you next time.